So the TV Times turned 70 years old on Monday the 22nd of September 2025. Didn't notice, did you? Unlike the Radio Times' centenary a couple of years ago, which was this whole big thing, its former ITV counterpart's anniversary was barely remarked upon at all. It did have a special anniversary cover with Sally Lindsay and Neil Dudgeon, as taken by Dan Goldsmith, but even that was a subscription-only thing. It's not really surprising, considering the severely diminished status of the TV Times here in the year of our Lord 2025. Its very existence could quite easily and nonchalantly be erased by its current owners by merging it with one or two extremely similar publications it also owns, all of which now look nearly identical anyway. But of course this wasn't always the case. It has been a long time since it was true, so long even I barely remember. But you used to need at least 2 TV listings magazines a week. Either that or a daily newspaper, and the listings in there would have been rudimentary at best. The BBC-produced Radio Times had details of their 2 channels and the radio. For ITV, commercial radio when it arrived, and after 1982 Channel 4, you turned to TV Times. And they had a plump festive issue at Christmas just like the Radio Times. For at least the first half of its existence, if you wanted to check out something particularly captivating on the other side, the faithful viewer would buy a copy of both magazines and circle their highlights with, well, a highlighter, or a pen. There would also be awash with many a sparkling interview with slightly more cut-price stars, some even in fancy dress if the photo shoot budget could be stretched that far. Even by the turn of the century, when the magazine contained double the listings, and even later still, it was seen as a viable alternative to the more stuffy-nosed content of its public service rival. It may not be as iconic, and there may not have been as many TV favourites featured as its BBC-powered competitor, but there was a time when it was just as important. This is a celebration of 70 years and 70 Christmases of the TV Times. Unlike the Radio Times, which took until a year after the birth of radio to get started, the TV Times was launched simultaneously with the ITV network on Thursday the 22nd of September 1955 by its first franchise holders, Associated Rediffusion. It wasn't the second TV-based magazine to exist by any means. There have been other publications like Scan, the television journal, the magazine for viewers, Television Weekly, Scan, again, no relation, later renamed TV News, and TV Mirror, later renamed TV Mirror and Disc News, and even later Picture Show and TV Mirror. The difference was that none of those were allowed to publish television listings. That was a privilege given only to Radio Times and the daily newspapers. With both the ITA and Associated Rediffusion realising that commercial television needed a paper-based outlet, TV Times was also afforded such a privilege. As with commercial television itself, it was clear from the very beginning that this was going to be a much more mainstream affair, if not a little more down-market. That wasn't necessarily a bad thing. The aim was to slightly prick the pomposity of the BBC and its magazine. The very first issue of TV Times, coming from Gough Square in London, made the difference between the 2 publications clear, with some explanatory text and a photo promoting 2 different shows, one featuring a glamorous Patricia Dainton and the other with the great Lucille Ball. This basic cover template would last for the next few months before the wording was sacrificed for a larger photograph taking up the whole of the front cover some point in the following year. You'd therefore be forgiven for expecting the very first Christmas issue to have done something very similar. And at first glance, 1955's Christmas cover is an extremely classy affair, with a portrait of the still relatively novel Mrs. Queen looking surprisingly coquettish and enigmatic. But in reality this isn't a specially commissioned piece, but rather a stock photo taken 4 years earlier, when she was still a princess, by photographer Sterling Henry Nahum, professionally known simply as Baron. A friend of Prince Philip, he was appointed a photographer to the royal family and was actually due to photograph Elizabeth II's coronation in 1953, but the Queen Mother chose Cecil Beaton instead, who himself would contribute photos to the magazine several years later. Being as it was in its infancy, the magazine lacked the capacity and or clout to commission any original photographs, at least of the Queen, and so they gradually built up their picture library over the next decade. However, one thing it could claim was some actual colour on the cover. As I recall from the Radio Times Christmas wrapping video, and if you haven't watched it, why not? Ink was still at a premium even 10 years after the war, and red was the only colour to which national publications had access. But while the Radio Times waited for another 2 years for colour to return to the cover, the TV Times got one up on them, having at least some red on it right from the start, even if it was only in the masthead. As for Baron, he set up his own company, Baron Studios, but didn't live to do anything much with it because he died less than a year after this issue came out, although the business itself would continue until the mid-70s. But at least he died with his legacy secured with this rather timeless initial Christmas issue. 1956 gave us this charming photo of what I assume is a typical 50s Christmas, all paper chains, chintz curtains and cards piled on a huge wooden box with a tiny window studded in it saying Happy Christmas, which made up a TV in those days. This was taken by the late Peter Bolton, who was the TV Times chief staff photographer, joining the magazine at its conception and remaining there for the next 40 years or so. And this took a while to find out, because if you thought the Radio Times were bad at crediting their artists, and they were, not only were the TV Times equally hit and miss for crediting their photographers, but their archives have changed hands so often over the years that a lot of the details have been scattered to the four winds. I can tell you we'll be hearing Peter Bolton's name quite a lot through the course of this programme, and we do know the name of one of the girls, Susan March, then Susan Ward, the daughter of the TV Times' first art editor, to whom we'll get shortly. 1957's cover was dominated by a huge glamour shot of the Queen in her second of 3 appearances on the cover. It's another stock photo, this time taken by Dorothy Wilding, the first woman to be awarded a royal warrant for photographing the King and Queen at the previous coronation in 1937. The reason for Liz's presence on the cover, in a photo that was actually taken again when she was still a princess some 6 years earlier, was that her speech that year was the first to be properly televised, after the previous 5 were broadcast in sound only, presumably over a photo of her face, or a flag, or a big picture of a forelock with the occasional caption reading, "Tug Now." This year would also see 2 important milestones for the TV Times: expansion and diversification, sort of. The former was marked not only by production moving to Television House, although it moved again in April to new offices in Holborn, but also by the first TV Times Christmas Extra. The Radio Times had briefly experimented with annuals over the previous 3 years, and while those didn't last, the rival magazine still decided to try something similar. This first one features a colourised version of a black and white photo of Patricia Driscoll, playing the second maid Marian in the Adventures of Robin Hood, having taken over the role from Bernadette O'Farrell. The photo was taken by Jack Dooley. As for diversification, new ITV franchisees were popping up all the time, and while some of them simply joined up with the TV Times for listings purposes, it wasn't a hard and fast rule, yet, and many of the more self-possessed regions launched their own magazines, either produced in-house or under licence. The first of these was the blandly named TV Guide from those old rebels Scottish television, unsurprisingly published by Roy Herbert Thompson, aka the first Baron Thompson of Fleet, owner of the Scotsman Publications, the home of many distinguished Scottish newspapers and also of Scottish television itself. Their first issue saw Thompson promising the best in TV, such as the glamorous Moira Shearer bursting in above a glum-looking Alastair Sim. Their first Christmas issue made the rather worrying promise of a bulging sackful of festive fun, involving the severed heads of Tony Wright, Shani Wallace, Johnny Ray, Terry Thomas, Ronald Shiner and Harry Secombe. Get used to his face in particular. Alongside them, heads unsevered, are singing sisters Jackie and Gillian Moran from the show Small Time, presumably so named because they never hit the big time, and a message from Dr. Harry Whitley of St Giles's Cathedral in Edinburgh. It's all much less fashionable looking than the TV Times, more like a tabloid newspaper than a TV listings magazine, with its advert for clothing and knitwear at the bottom. And indeed the quality of these regional alternatives varied wildly over the next decade. While we managed to find credits for the TV Times covers, there's no chance in hell we'd have found all the people responsible for the regional magazine covers. Otherwise I'd be here forever. Practically am already. 1958's Christmas TV Times sported an original John Leech illustration of Mr. and Mrs. Fezziwig's Christmas Party from Charles Dickens's A Christmas Carol. This apparently tied in with a musical version showing on Christmas Eve under the title The Merry Christmas. And this in turn seems to have been a remake of something Associated Rediffusion had made 3 years earlier for ITV's First Christmas. That version seems to have starred the Satan-browed Hugh Griffith as Ebenezer Scrooge and Martin Lawrence, as all three ghosts, composited into a single character simply called the Spirit of Christmas for the sake of making the story fit 45 minutes. A trick that Messrs Curtis and Elton would repeat with Blackadder and Robbie Coltrane, and probably more entertainingly. Here in the 1958 version, Stephen Murray starred as Scrooge, with the spirits separated out properly once again. The author's granddaughter, Monica Dickens, is also on hand to give her opinion in the TV Times. Also in this issue, a message from Geoffrey Fisher, the Archbishop, more forelock tugging, some words from Walt Disney, and some short stories so that the TV Times can pretend to be the people's friend. The Christmas Extra that year would see the start of a programme that would endure for another decade, specifically employing a cartoonist to provide a suitably amusing cover. The magazine would feature a prominent cartoon page under various names for many years, employing a small pool of draftspeople for several years. The cartoonist fished out that pool for this cover was known simply as Scherzo. Despite some painstaking research, his real name remains elusive. This is by design, incidentally. Asked for a picture and biography for a later article, he submitted a cartoon and a blurb that left out any hint of a real name. But if you know of a shy northern cartoonist born in the mid-1920s and who went by this pen name, please write in, as it's giving my co-writer sleepless nights. Meanwhile in Scotland, the TV Guide that year seemed to take inspiration from the TV Times a year earlier, going with a photo of Mrs. Queen again. The justification this time was that it was her last live televised speech, all future editions being pre-recorded. There's also a floating Max Bygraves, another future TV Times cover star, an advert for nylons, and a chance to win a Hogmanay hamper. 1958 saw the launch of another regional breakaway in the form of Television Weekly for TWW in South Wales and the west of England. Published under licence by Burroughs Newspapers Limited, and not to be confused by the publication of the same name that began in 1949 and had long since died. This one lasted a full decade and had 2 editions each week for the Wales and West sub-regions. It was the longest running of the pre-national TV Times magazines, although in its time it ended up covering listings for 4 different stations: TWW, the original 18-month Teledu company operated by WWN, the interim independent television service for Wales and the West, and finally Harlech Television, later HTV. His first cover emulated the initial Radio Times some 3.5 decades previously by centering around a word from the boss, in this case Edward John Stanley, 18th Earl of Derby, introducing a veritable cavalcade of mostly Welsh stars appearing in the opening show. Their first Christmas cover also looks more like something from the Radio Times. Once again, your star is Mrs. Queen, alongside Prince Philip and tiny Prince Charles and Princess Anne. Fortunately, this was before the 60s, so he avoided that other one, Who Isn't Anything. 1959's Christmas TV Times was the first issue with a cover themed around the specific items that Christmas, just under a decade before the Radio Times first deigned to do the same. It is therefore the first example of what will become the magazine's most familiar pattern: the TV stars in Christmassy arrangement, with photography by Peter Bolton and design by Leonard Ward, the magazine's first art editor of whom I spoke earlier, whose daughter was on the earlier cover. Of course, nearly 70 years on, most of these then household names just look like random people to anyone not a student of 50s television. There's actually more to this arrangement than meets the eye. Because of the varying broadcast regions in London, the Midlands and the North, each having their own versions of the schedule, there were 3 variations of this cover, which was the only time it really happened. From left to right, the London edition features Hughie Green and Jean Clark, Tommy Steele and Jack Parnell, Michael Medwin and Shirley Bassey, Jill Brown and Frederick Bartman from Emergency Ward 10, Peter Brough and his disturbing ventriloquial figure Archie Andrews, Marty Wilde and Cherry Wayner, and Bill Fraser and Alfie Bass as Bootsy and Snudge in the Army game. The Midlands edition rearranged the baubles and swapped out Medwin and Bassey for the region's undisputed Empress Noel Gordon, alongside Roy Edwards. And then the Northern edition went further still. Out went Brough, Andrews, Gordon and Edwards, and in came Chris Howland and Bill Grundy, he of the infamous Sex Pistols interview, and Yogi Bear and Huckleberry Hound. The latter pair probably the most recognisable faces on any of these to anyone these days, with the possible exception of Shirley Bassey, of course. Tommy Steele, perhaps. Maybe Bootsy and Snudge at a stretch. The Christmas Extra front cover that year was also done by Leonard Ward, who was a cartoonist in his own right, using various labels like Len Ward, LW and Nelwood. In the other regions, TV Guide wishes Scottish viewers a Merry Christmas with star shows to prove it. The stars again appearing in Christmas tree bauble arrangement: Tommy Steele, appearing from the TV Times, Gregory Peck, Cary Grant and Alexis Smith, Dennis Lotis, and Glasgow's own singer Sheila Patton, and an advert for Scotch whisky to wash it all down after the evening buffet. Television Weekly mirrored the Galaxy of Stars approach, albeit in a more utilitarian way. There are also 2 new regional magazines this year: The Viewer for the Tyne Tees region, published by News Chronicle and Dickens Press Limited, proudly displaying the 3 Tees logo, and TV Post, covering Ulster Television, owned by Century Newspapers Limited. The Viewer's emphasis appeared to be on big stars. Their very first issue showcased Dickie Henderson, Jill Day and a pained Bill Maynard. And indeed their first Christmas is out-and-out cheesecake. 18-year-old actress Pat Lawrence literally on the television. And in full colour, no less. TV Post is more austere, with tiny pictures of Ronnie Carroll and Alma Cogan joining Archie Andrews and Tommy Steele, all duplicated from the Radio Times, as well as an advert for clothing. Into the 60s. While there were no new regional magazines launched in 1960, Associated Rediffusion had by now created a subsidiary company called TV Publications Limited for that exact purpose, with their original partners Associated Newspapers having pulled out of the franchise a couple of years earlier. They'd also created their first attempt at a mascot, the downright disturbing TV Times man, who showed up in adverts in 1959 and 1960 to promote the listings. But because of his rather eerie design, essentially a cheerful sex offender, he thankfully didn't catch on. I mean, you can see his belly button. God, I hope that's his belly button. Tivy, a few years later, was much more successful, but he doesn't really figure on any of these Christmas covers, so sod him. For Christmas of 1960, they went with the cover promoting ABC's big Christmas presentation. With Christmas falling on a Sunday, it was the Weekend franchisee's stamping ground this year. Alice Through the Looking Box was some kind of modern updating of Lewis Carroll, I expect. From all indications, it was insanely ambitious, particularly for a weekend station, and seems like it might well have been really good, or at the very least a fascinating disaster. Sadly, we'll never know, because if it was ever recorded at all, it's long since been lost. All we have to go on is this picture by Peter Bolton showing Jeannie Carson's Alice looking understandably wary of being manhandled by Spike Milligan, pushing her ever closer to, yes, Harry Secombe, finally making it to the TV Times Christmas cover for the first but not the last time. Sadly, it wasn't a full Goon Show reunion, as Peter Sellers was busy with his movie career and Michael Bentine was preoccupied with turning the BBC One Globe into a square world. But he was still quite the all-star cast. Here we can see a TV-themed tea party with Bernard Bresslaw as the March Hare dunking an upside-down Ronnie Corbett as the Dormouse into a cup of tea with the help of Ron Moody's Hatter. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. The full cast, as well as many other celebrities, were given caricatures on the cover of the TV Post, drawn by Chaz, aka Charles Sinclair. We had Donald Pleasance as the Stone Caterpillar, Bob Monkhouse as the Cheshire Cat, Barbara Kelly as herself, Jeannie Carson as Alice, Bernard Braden as himself, and altogether too many others to list right now without this becoming some kind of early 60s light entertainment ASMR video or something. On the cover of the Christmas Extra, we had some brats singing Good King Wenceslas, or trying to. One of them's clearly trying to put some groove into the performance. Good kid. As depicted by cartoonist Zeke, aka Canadian Arthur Penhale. Over in Scotland, TV Guide has a star-spangled Christmas, including the legendary Lonnie Donegan, Jeannie Carson, again doubling up from the TV Times as Alice, Joe Douglas, playing record requests for the armed forces in a show including Donegan, Tommy Steele again, and Donald Wolfett, no relation to Bro and Bro, as James Saywood in the armchair theatre production The Great Gold Bullion Robbery. This year's mouthwash drink of choice is Drambuie. Drambuie! The Viewer had more American-style cheesecake, taken by Tom Oxley of the Barry Sisters and June and Angela, stars of the local show Request Time, not to be confused with the American double act of the same name. Television Weekly saw a more ecclesiastical cover, with TWW's Pontcanna Children's Choir flanked by some nativity figures drawn by Peter Manders. In 1961, Harry Secombe had the entire TV Times cover to himself, dressed as a plump Welsh Santa pulling a faintly psychotic expression, taken again by Peter Bolton. To be fair, the boggle-eyed grin was Secombe's trademark, but it could often verge on the unsettling, or in cases like this go right over the verge into the realms of absurdist horror. At least it wasn't a 2-week issue in those days. Featuring a special pull-out section about Coronation Street, which had started the previous December and took ITV rather by surprise by outliving its initial 13-week commission. That year's Christmas Extra went with a Western-themed cartoon drawn by cartoonist Roy Raymond. Up in Alba, STV's TV Guide had its last Christmas this year, as by the following year it had folded. More on that later, but as if they knew their time was limited, they decided to pull out all the stops with their most star-studded cover of all. At least it was then. Now they're just some people you're unlikely to have heard of. But don't worry, here's some more Drambuie for you.
Yeah, alright, you've got to put something in for the birds, haven't you?
Having its first Christmas this year was Westwood Television, who also had their own listings magazine, albeit outsourced well up country. Look Westwood was run at the same stable as The Viewer, hence both having the same covers. Their cover star, in full colour no less, was TV hostess Elizabeth Kingdon, espousing some beauty secrets. And both magazines have the surprising honour of having the first ever Christmas and New Year double issue, long before the practice was normalised. Meanwhile, Television Weekly continued the religious theme of the previous year, with some sheep in Your Actual Bethlehem, taken by Ronald Pilgrim. And TV Post wished viewers a Merry Max, as Max Bygraves tried to give Piccola Pupa a heart attack via exploding balloon. 1962's Christmas TV Times, which came after a change of logo, eschewed such secular concerns as big photos of stars, even such non-secular stars as Harry Secombe, and kicked off a run of Christmas issues adorned with cute kiddywink. This one, with Peter Bolton, on photography duties again, depicts a pious photo of some choir boys with mouths wide in praise of the Lord, either that or yawning. The main one in the foreground is Giles Summerhaze, whose name we only know as his own mother proudly outed him in an issue the following year. Santa's mouth is also wide, in deep conversation with an interviewer on the cover of the Christmas Extra, drawn again by Leonard Ward. As mentioned, STV's TV Guide folded in April 1962. To replace it, following an agreement between the Scotsman Publications Limited and the Daily News Limited, the Viewer, already going strong in 90s, added the Scottish bow to its quiver by incorporating their listings as well in a new, brighter and glossier format. That Christmas they also had a cartoon with Santa, drawn by John Billy Wilkinson, known as Wilk, as did its sister magazine Look Westward. Television Weekly went with the cast of the Dickie Henderson Christmas show, joining Dickie were Richard Wattis, Leslie Saroni, Rita Webb, Bernard Bresslaw, and regulars John Parsons, June Laverick and Lionel Merton. Over in Northern Ireland, TV Post went with Pat Phoenix, another face which will recur several times on these covers, joined by boys from the Martin Boys Choir, and like last year an advert for self-driving cars? And there were two more new magazines this year, each for a new region in the network. One was Wales TV, or alternatively Collated Cymru. This was a bilingual listings magazine published by Wales West and North Publications Limited for the short-lived and similarly named, known on screen also as Collated Cymru. Their first of only 2 Christmas issues had a very simple, if not outright cheap cover of red and monochrome avant-garde baubles, with the Welsh dragon in red of course, wishing readers an Adolyg Llawen. The other debutant was Channel Viewer for the last ITV franchise to launch, not counting TVAM or Oracle of course, published by Channel Islands Communications Limited. It prominently displayed their new televisual logo, a prancing if stylised Norman leopard, as found in the heraldic devices of the Channel Islands and Normandy, with the 6 hexagons representing Jersey, Guernsey, Alderney, Herms, Sark and Jethu. Their first Christmas cover is devoted to Tommy Steele as Quincy alongside children from the Peggy O'Farrell School in Quincy's Quest, apparently a Christmas musical for any children aged between 4 and 74. So if you're a toddler or 75 and over, you had a luck. The following year, 1963, if you've already lost count, was almost a mirror image of the TV Times' previous cover, with a pious little girl facing a red stripe on the other side, photographed again by Peter Bolton. The big difference, of course, was that full colour was finally back. No more line drawings in shades of red. Unfortunately, the Christmas Extra that year was far more terrifying. See? Apparently, the original painting, by Spanish artist Rufino Ceballos, was one of the most treasured possessions of Dickie Henderson. Each to their own, I guess. In Wales, Collated Cymru's big show was an episode of Shirley Temple's storybook. This episode, if you hadn't figured it out, was the Land of Oz, shown on Gwyl Sant Steffan, i.e. St. Stephen's Day, i.e. Boxing Day. The cover shows Temple as Princess Ozma, Jonathan Winters as General Nick Dick, don't laugh, and Agnes Moorehead as Mombi the Witch. The compatriot magazine Television Weekly had decided to promote the more homegrown adaptation of Mr. Pickwick, part of the ITV Playhouse strand, with Arthur Lowe as the titular character, Roy Kinnear as Sergeant Buzzfuzz, Deborah Millington and Harriet Harper as Emily and Isabella Wardle, and Gordon Rollings as Mr. Jingle. Down in the southwest, and simultaneously up in Scotland and Tyne Teesland, both Look Westwards and the Viewers covers are given over entirely to Pat Phoenix's Elsie Tanner, enjoying a drink literally on the bar. In Ulster, TV Post had a giant profile of a cute little girl named Amanda Dawson, whose parents were taking part in Double Your Money, with baubles plastered with the usual star faces all around, including Michael Dennison as Boyd QC, Cliff Richard, Jill Brown as Nurse Carol Young in Emergency Ward 10, and Shirley Temple again. And we had another galaxy of stars in the Channel Viewer, including Patrick Macnee and Honor Blackman in The Avengers, Michael Miles, Roger Moore, and Shirley Temple yet again. She was a pretty big deal. all designed by a Jersey company called Wise. Another adorable little girl, taken once again by Peter Bolton, adorned the TV Times in 1964, justified by a charity tie-in with the NSPCC and Pat Phoenix. Fair enough. Christmas Extra saw Leonard Ward imagining Father Christmas as the fifth Beatle or something. The viewer decided to go with Tommy Steele as Dick Whittington in his self-penned pantomime Richard Whittington Esquire, an image which was actually used as the cover for the TV Times the week before Christmas. This actually marked the last Christmas edition of the viewer in STV land, as the region would simply adopt the TV Times on 24th of September the following year. It would continue being the magazine of choice in the Tyne-Tees region though. And Look Westward, of course, went with the same photo. The TV Post had Miss TV Post Maureen Shannon, photographed by Robert Anderson, switching on all the holiday shows, while Channel Viewer went with a stylized Christmas tree apparently exploding blood, with the channel logo redesigned with a Christmas message. Just as terrifying in a different way was local Wales and West presenter Alan Taylor and his glove puppet Tinker on the cover of Television Weekly, part of their Christmas party on Christmas morning. The reaction of that boy tells you all you need to know about that show. One Morning magazine began on 27th September this year, actually usurping the TV Times in the Midlands. TV World was jointly owned by ABC and ATV through their joint venture Aston Publications, and was produced on their behalf by Oddams. Whilst their first issue boasted Shirley Bassey, their first Christmas issue was a little unsettling, with Julie Rogers worrying the sandwich between Mike and Bernie Winters. The Schnorbits isn't around yet. In 1965, beneath another new masthead logo, the TV Times used what at first glance looks like another adorable little girl, but is actually a painting by Florence Kroger of the boy Jesus, who apparently had a mullet 2 decades before it was invented. Truly he was the Son of God. This one's about as religious as the TV Times ever got at Christmas. And the Christmas Extra featured the last cartoon cover by Leonard Ward, although he would continue at the magazine as art editor until it went national, and after that continued for many years as a freelance cartoonist. Going westward ho, we had the fantastically alluring Diana Rigg as Emma Peel in The Avengers, and the promise of a space game for children. In fact, The Avengers seemed to be the star show that year. Unsurprisingly, both Look Westward and The Viewer had Diana on the cover, although they went with alternative shots of Rigg in different costumes. TV World used another alternative shot of the same photo, along with a smaller one of the American singer Lena Horne. And the Channel Viewer had yet another Rigg photo, this time joined by Patrick McNee as John Steed. Meanwhile, the TV Post employed Chaz once more to produce more caricatures, this time of Brucey, Hayley Mills, Cliff and Arthur Haynes. While Television Weekly, which by now covered all of Wales, or all of Wales that had television after the collapse of WWN, went behind the scenes at the magic of television itself and found some mischievous, ugly Welsh children who I don't trust an inch. Especially this one. Finna call Max von Sydow on that kid. In 1966, beneath a reverently blinged out logo, the TV Times cover star was Miss Lady Queen for the third and final time, in yet another stock photo, this time taken by Anthony Buckley. There was nothing particularly special about the speech this year that called for it. I think they just realised they hadn't done a Queen cover since they went back to full colour. Get that squared away. The Christmas Extra cover was drawn by returning Roy Baymond. For its penultimate Christmas cover, Look Westward deviated from The Viewer again, as they had the promise of the many faces of Harry Secombe, underneath the regular faces of John Pett, Susan Denny, Michael Reinhold, and none other than Augustus Jeremiah Honeybun at a Christmas fancy dress party, apparently all in knock-off Batman costumes, except Gus, who didn't bother. TV World instead went with the actual faces of Secombe, unfortunately including a racist one. Bruce Forsyth and the lovely Alita Morrison trying to distract him in the middle there. Television Weekly also gave their cover over to Secombe, although at least in their case he was local, this time with an even longer beard than 5 years earlier, and complete with moustache. Channel Viewer put Brucey and Alita centre stage. The Viewer had some Geordie or possibly Mackham schoolchildren singing Christmas carols, while the TV post with a new modern logo showed the aftermath of a fight to the death between three schoolchildren to plant an angel on top of the Christmas tree. Possibly. 1967 was TV Times' last Christmas under the old format, before all the regions were commanded to share it. Lord Charles Hill, aka Baron Hill of Luton, head of the ITA, had realised that the current setup was too confusing and convoluted, and the quality varied too much from region to region. With the situation untenable, at least as far as he was concerned, he therefore commanded all of the ITV regions to form a new jointly owned company that would buy the TV Times outright and turn it into a single national listings magazine for all the regions in the ITV network, whether they liked it or not. Well, all but one exception. The Channel Viewer would continue to be published separately, as its sales were among Channel Television's biggest financial contributions, and the company lived a hand-to-mouth existence as it was. And besides, they wouldn't have been able to afford to chip in their share of the start-up costs for a new jointly owned company anyway, so the separate magazine would continue for a few years yet in the Isles. It's also the last time the TV Times Christmas cover would be a vaguely religious photograph. From now until the 90s, they'd always be images related to something or someone that was on over a season. Although technically so is this, because this photo, once more taken by Peter Bolton, is of the parish church of St James's in Beerton, Buckinghamshire, which was to pay host to the televised Christmas morning service that year. The Christmas extra was predominantly red, with an amusing sketch by cartoonist Terence Parks, aka Larry, because cartoonists can call themselves whatever they want. So as for the last issues of the regions, Television Weekly promoted Cliff Richard in the pantomime Aladdin, with the Shadows as Wishy, Washy, Noshy and Poshy. The Viewer and Look Westward, with a new snazzy lowercase font on the station name, because why not, also showed Cliff opposite co-star Vanessa Howard. TV World went with Benny Hill in his eponymous show. TV Post went with some carol singers, the lovely Amy MacDonald, Brucey, Dave Allen and Cliff again. And Channel Viewer went with Coronation Street, which was a centrepiece on the big day before it became a really big thing, for it to be a centrepiece on the big day. In 1968, of course, it was all change for ITV in general, and that included the listings. The TV Times went fully national for the first time on Saturday the 21st of September 1968. The magazine was now published by Independent Television Publications Limited, named so that they could cater for other specialist magazines, including future children's publication Look-In. It wasn't a universally popular move. Copies of the TV Post, for example, were burned on the floor of the Northern Ireland Assembly in protest, although quite frankly they had increasingly bigger things to worry about there. The new editor, Peter Jackson, and its new art director, Gordon Moore, brought a new, fresher and glossier look to the magazine, which coincided with an expansion of the brand that saw the introduction of Miss TV Times and the TV Times Awards, both of which were eventually televised, and with Jackson himself on hosting duties for the latter. That year's Christmas cover stars were the actress Julia Foster and Ben Fogle's big sister Emily, although the cover seems to suggest that Foster hasn't come up with a name for her yet and is just referring to her as Baby. That's just how he talked in those days. Taken by Ray Rathbone, who would go on to do a trilogy of Radio Times Christmas covers in the early 70s. The Christmas extra that year was the last fully illustrated cover, this time with Mr. S. Claus fronting a psychedelic-looking band known as The Reindeer. About as 1968 as it gets. Drawn by Fritz Wegner, who also did the Radio Times Christmas cover 15 years previously. It was also the last time it would use the name Christmas Extra for a quarter of a century. Meanwhile, the Channel Viewer continued on as before, sometimes but not always delivering completely different covers to its national counterpart. This year, for instance, gives it over to a bearded Eamon Andrews, drawn by none other than Julia Foster. Christmas 1969 saw the first Christmas and New Year double issue of both the Radio and the TV Times. The latter was probably the most Christmassy design they'd had yet, all glitter and ribbons and wrapping paper, designed by John Freeman and dominated by Des O'Connor, giving a disturbingly predatory stare from behind a pasted-on, tashless Amish Santa beard. The TV Times Christmas Extra, meanwhile, had expanded into a wider range of supplements sold throughout the 70s for a variety of specialist programme tie-ins. The festive edition, subtitled Christmas with the Stars, featured physical models for the first and only time, created by Richard Weaver and photographed by Gordon MacLeish. It showed eerie, dead-eyed papier-mâché simulacra of Tommy Steele, Tommy Cooper, Amy MacDonald and Max Bygraves, floating in an endless void without space equipment, so as to tie in with that year's moon landing, for which they did use space equipment. As for the channel viewer, they opted for a shot from Father Dear Father, starring Patrick Cargill as Patrick Glover and Natasha Pine as his daughter Anna, part of the so-called All-Star Comedy Carnival, ITV's answer to the BBC's Christmas Night with the Stars, which was apparently so brilliant it didn't need to appear on the cover of the main national magazine. This set the template for TV Times' long-term Christmas future as the 70s rolled around. Christmas 1970 saw a lovely masthead, multiple Santas, a robin, a snowman, a sprig of holly, and of course snow on the logo, and the first semi-regular mention of glittering entertainment on ITV. But the accompanying full-page picture was rather less seasonal. A snap by Ian Vaughan of Val Doonican and Max Bygraves, the real one this time, splitting the difference between mohair and polyester. They could at least have dressed in Father Christmas outfits, or pretended to have a snowball fight or something. Well, considering this was in the midst of the ITV colour strike, I suppose it was lucky we got any programming at all. But don't worry, because you can find an alternative in the Christmas with the Stars supplement, in the form of the lovely Moira Foote, then starring alongside Ronnie Barker in Hark at Barker. I'm pretty sure I can guess what the male readers would find more interesting to read. I also suspect that particular demographic would be less interested in Channel Viewers cover star Gracie Fields. For 1971, Barbara Murray demonstrates that unlike Doonican and Bygraves, she knows what she's doing. Who Killed Santa Claus was a play under the ITV Saturday Night Theatre strand. Despite getting what amounts to top billing on the cover of the TV Times, it didn't even run on Christmas Day. Christmas Day was Friday, so it showed on Boxing Day instead. That doesn't say a lot for ITV's Christmas lineup that year. But like I say, at least we got a nice Christmassy photo for the cover, courtesy of freelance photographer John Timbers, who also did a Radio Times Christmas cover and an alternative version for the newly and rather confusingly renamed Channel Television Times. I mean, it's not too much to ask, is it, a bit of dressing up? Even just a festive hat would be welcome, as demonstrated by some of the Coronation Street cast on Christmas with the Stars. Pat Phoenix as Elsie Tanner, Violet Carson as Ina Sharples, and Peter Adamson as Len Fairclough, all enjoying a leisurely drink at the Rovers with a couple of tiny, tacky Christmas trees. And just as I asked for more festive costuming, the monkeys' paw curls. Well, we were going to come to it eventually. In 1972, same year the IGA became the IBA, the TV Times cover featured Jack Smethurst as Eddie Booth and Rudolph Walker as Bill Reynolds in the wildly popular unbroadcastable sitcom Love Thy Neighbour, in a photo taken by Roderick Ebden, TV Times' second staff photographer who joined the magazine about a decade earlier. The same photo was also used for the Channel Television Times too. Great, thanks. As if to compensate for this, the Christmas with the Stars pullout had a fun photo of Auntie Anita Harris about to throw a snowball at your face. 1973's cover was at least less offensive than the previous year, taken by the third TV Times staff photographer, the late Ron McFarlane, who is absolutely not the father of Seth. This is promoting the fourth and last Carry On Christmas, which was also one of the last Carry On projects that Sir Sidney James worked on before his untimely death 2 years later. He played a department store Santa alongside cover co-star Barbara Windsor in a framing story around a set of sketches that start out halfway decent and get worse. It doesn't even have Kenneth Williams or Hattie Jakes in it. The miniature Father Christmas flying through the logo makes his third consecutive appearance, and he'll be back on and off for several more years yet, as will that year's official Christmas on ITV logo, as seen on network trailers, usually put together by Granada or occasionally ATV. An alternate version, Sans Christmas Tree, was used for the Channel Television Times. This year also saw the penultimate pull-out variation of the Christmas Extra, which disappeared for a few years, now known as the All-Star Spectacular, and complete with Val Doonican in an unseasonably lurid checkered pink ensemble with pink pullover holding a slightly more seasonable sacrificial donkey. I'm not sure who I feel more sorry for out of the two of them, to be honest. 1974 saw an end to this run of faintly troubling Christmas TV times, with Tommy Steele in a jerkin reading Danish fairy tales to a group of Aryan children on the set of George Lucas's THX 1138, as taken by Rod Ebton, whose son Simon was one of the children, alongside Peter Bolton's daughters Claire, Helen and Emma. Tommy appears to be a bit further along in the story on the Channel Television Times version, and meanwhile Tiny Santa is having a little sit down. He's absent altogether in 1975, as the cover is adorned by a lovely, if not especially Christmassy, cartoon of various ITV stars in a hot air balloon piloted by Sooty on an unseasonably sunny day. The artist was Stephen Nemethy, a regular contributor to the magazine and a pretty impressive caricaturist. Here he's captured David Essex, Sooty, who again appears to be flying the thing, Nina Baden-Semper from Love Thy Neighbour, Barbara Windsor again, Tony Selby as Corporal Percy Marsh GM in Get Some In, Elizabeth Taylor, Les Dawson doing his familiar look at finding out he's being piloted by a puppet bear, Fred Astaire, Frankie Howard, Charlie Carioli, Peter O'Toole as T. Lawrence, Angela Baddeley from Upstairs Downstairs, Bing Crosby, and dangling from Frankie's bagpipes, Andy Stewart. And again the same picture is used for the Channel Islands, who by now had shortened their magazine's name to Channel TV Times to confuse you further. More accurately, it looks to be an early version of the artwork before TV Times asked for a few revisions to make Elizabeth Taylor smile and Angela Baddeley look less like a terrifying goblin. Father Christmas is back on the logo in 1976 as the Galaxy of Stars format returns, this time in photographic form. Rod Ebton took at least one of these photos, but most of them are likely taken from previous shoots, spliced together by picture editor Eddie Pedder and his deputy Ted Nunn, possibly with assistance from art director Stan Glazer, the father of the Oscar-winning director Jonathan. It's not as aesthetically appealing as the previous years, but it is Christmas here, and the overspill, implying that ITV's Christmas schedule has just too much talent to fit on the cover, is a nice touch. Although there isn't actually anybody cut off, they're just duplicates of the other faces. Sorry if that spoils the magic. It might have helped if everyone had been looking at the camera instead of casting sidelong glances at each other, or gazing into the middle distance like Pat Phoenix, or giving a slightly pained expression like Brucey. But that's the danger of using old photos and yoo-hooing them onto Santa costumes. Very much the 70s equivalent of Photoshop, or even more modernly, AI slop. For Christmas 1977, TV Times fought against Punk's Year Zero with a resolutely square tableau taken by Steve Campbell of George and Mildred Roper, i.e. Brian Murphy and Youtha Joyce, out carolling, surrounding a baffled Harry Secombe, making his second Christmas TV Times appearance, having been surprisingly absent from the previous year's grid, and a tiny Bonnie Langford, not that there's any other kind. And Mini Father Christmas is still sat in front of the telly box. Over in the Channel Islands they gave their whole cover over to the Muppets, airing on ATV, and quite right too. And this is still several years before they collaborated with Charles Dickens and Michael Caine and practically made Christmas their own. Kind of a pity this wasn't the nationwide cover, really. In 1978, Thames pulled off a genuine coup, comprising Morecambe and Wise from the BBC, although unfortunately not their head writer. Naturally, when their usual stamping ground of Christmas came along, TV Times wasn't going to pass it up, although they apparently also weren't going to go to more effort than usual. They simply had Eric and Ernie in Santa suits with a monochrome cutout of Sean Connery as James Bond in a white void, and Eric rather disturbingly looking down the barrel of a gun. The photographer was Bill Francis. Radio Times would at least have had them in tuxedos, posing against some kind of tunnel effect. Oh well. Father Christmas makes his final appearance in the masthead, which would have changed into the more familiar TV Times logo in a couple of years, in which he wouldn't have fit anyway. On the Channel TV Times, we had not one but two soaps. Jane Rossington as Jill Harvey, Ronald I Am a Screaming Homosexual Allen as David Hunter, Noel Gordon as Meg Mortimer, Joy Andrews as Tish Hope, and Elizabeth Croft as Edith Tatum represented the Crossroads Motel, surrounded by an uncredited vicar and parishioners at a Chris Dingle ceremony. While Betty Driver as Betty Turpin, Doris Speed as Annie Walker, and Fred Feast as Fred G represented Corrie at the Rovers, with Random Black Guy in the background. Oh, and there's an appearance for Channel's equivalent of Gus Honeybun, Oscar Puffin, or to give him his full name, Oscar Corbière Claude Grosnay Puffin, apparently eating the Christmas tree. 1979's Christmas TV Times closed the decade with something that wasn't the most pleasant thing to look at over 2 weeks, despite the cover star being the extremely aesthetically pleasing Faye Dunaway. Well, she was then. This was a shot taken during filming of Richard Lester's The Three Musketeers, most likely by that film's director of photography, David Watkin. And the film was indeed airing over the Christmas period, but frankly it deserved better than this unpleasant and unchristmassy shade of lime green. Also starring various Muppets, Morecambe and Wise again, this time as disturbing proto-spitting image caricatures drawn by Dave Smith, and Kenny Everett's Captain Elvis Brandenburg Kremen, drawn as usual by Graham Kennedy, as were Carla Short and Dr. Heinrich von Gitfinger. I'm sure Carla's presence there made the average teenage boy very happy. This was a double issue, lime green or no lime green. Not that there was a huge amount actually on ITV over the festive period, given that this came a mere 2 months after the national strike that prevented any new television being made, with Channel alone continuing to broadcast out of sheer determination until it was all resolved in October. Speaking of Channel, their Channel TV Times had the same cover, but boxed inside a television screen, which just made everything seem more cramped. This year also saw a one-off revival of the Christmas Extra magazine supplement, now renamed the Christmas Party Time Special, and it was a pretty impressive party by the looks of it. Alongside singular goodie Bill Oddie on piano, we had Anne Bruzak, Nicholas Parsons, Anne Aston, Clive Dunn, the Beverly Sisters, Jack Douglas, Jenny Lee Wright, George Camella, Barry Evans, Prunella G and Diane Keane. Into the 80s. 1980, the first Christmas TV Times of the decade, was also one of their best festive covers ever. It's Morecambe and Wise in Santa suits alongside Bond again, but this time done properly. There's a proper set, and Bond, Roger Moore this time, is actually there. In our case, the ski resort is blatantly a photographic backdrop, but what do you want, jam on it? Also present, Janet Brown as Mrs. Thatcher. All taken by Paul Stokes, the fourth and final TV Times staff photographer who joined the magazine when it went national. Channel TV Times again went for the exact same cover, not boxed in this time thankfully, and for whatever reason using the actual National TV Times logo. In 1981, the year of the franchise round that saw the fall of Southern to TVS and the rise of Central from the ashes of ATV, TV Times adopted their famous square logo, which they stuck with for almost 40 years, albeit with a touch of evolution. They also gained the word magazine in the name, but that didn't last. Unfortunately, the iconic logo's first Christmas wasn't the best one it ever had. The colours rotated in those days, apparently through Strongbad's method of colour wheel roulette.
No worries, no worries. Oh, ouch, man.
Yes, unfortunately for the Christmas issue, the wheel stopped at roughly the same shade of lime green as 2 years earlier, which, combined with a darker green and orange, somehow managed to subliminally replicate the image of bile splashing around ominously in your stomach after a bout of overindulgence. In that respect, it was probably quite apt for Christmas. The photo wasn't the best they'd ever used either. Another eerie shot of Harry Secombe in his final Christmas cover appearance, this time taken by Mike Leal and giving his serial killer smile from inside a Santa suit. This time they didn't give him the beard. The same photo was used for the Channel TV Times cover as well, once again boxed in. Now that's more like it. For 1982, TV Times' first Christmas with Channel 4 alongside ITV, they hired the great Cecil Vivek, an art student of Johannesburg Art School who did some wonderfully detailed covers for Reader's Digest, The Sunday Telegraph, The Observer, Pan Books, and many more. For Christmas, he's illustrated a sumptuous welcome into the home of ITV, figuratively speaking, occupied by the likes of Christopher Reeve's Superman, Russ Abbott, David Frost, Roger Moore's Bond again, Farrah Fawcett, Liza Minnelli, Morecambe and Wise in their final cover appearance, The Snowman in its debut with the boy James, and Charlie Chaplin being hugged/smothered by Miss Piggy, alongside Kermit the Frog and Fozzie Bear, all surrounded by holly, a robin and snow on the logo, plus a chance to win 50 grand. Possibly one of the best covers they had, as did Channel TV Times, and one of the few illustrated Christmas covers until they became more commonplace in the 90s and the 21st century. Sadly, Cecil Vivek died in November at an age unspecified but above 80. As well as the debut of Channel 4, of course, this year saw the introduction of S4C. And while they didn't get a full-blown magazine, the ITV regions already being covered in the TV Times itself, they did at least get a pull-out weekly listing supplement. Spec, Welsh for Peak, launched with the new channel on 1st of November 1982. Distributed free with the Wales edition of TV Times and containing listings in both Welsh and English, as well as listings for Channel 4, although S4C itself would also feature programmes made by BBC Cymru Wales. The very first issue had a dramatic shot of hard rock singer Rhiannon Thomas straddling a motorbike, but the Christmas put-out that year was less striking and more whimsical, featuring the show Will Quack Quack, made by Serial Animation, the same ones that would go on to make Super Ted, based on a series of children's books written in the 30s by Jenny Thomas and John Owen Williams. And this cover actually features more snow than the TV Times itself, especially on the logo. In 1983, the TV Times turned to artist Len Thurston, who gave us this rather eerie, disproportionate depiction of the then Prince of Wales, Charles, with new wife Diana and son William, apparently in a parallel universe where the Waleses are a middle-class family of achondroplastic dwarves living in the suburbs of Welwyn Garden City. While the same illustration graced the cover of the Channel TV Times, over in Speckland, i.e. Wales, they went with a Christmas tree, decorated with their televisual highlights. And I want to apologise to my co-writer right now for not identifying them all, considering how mind-bendingly hard he worked to find all the titles, but this video's long enough as it is. 1984's Christmas TV Times and the Channel TV Times were graced by Russ Abbott in character as C.U. Jimmy, also in character as a fairy godmother, taken by Peter Bolton. Russ Abbott's Madhouse was still going strong on ITV, but despite its popularity they never put him on Christmas Day itself, although he did get a Hogmanay episode on New Year's Eve. A couple of years later he moved to the BBC, who immediately gave him pride of place on the big day for 4 years in a row. The writing was on the wall when he was moved to Boxing Day at the start of the 90s, and he eventually went back to ITV until his career finally became untenable even for Carlton Television. Note also the Galaxy of Stars making a return, albeit just in text form, as the TV Times starts embracing words on the cover more and more. Spec's cover was a lot more Spartan compared to last year, although that's not a bad thing. Just a simple gift-wrapped present design. The big show on ITV in 1985 was Minder on the Orient Express, and it was sufficiently important and or hyped that TV Times reeled in artist Paul Bryn Davies to provide an artistic interpretation of Dennis Waterman's Terry McCann and George Cole's Arthur Daly in the feature-length TV movie Extravaganza. Well, I don't think this scene was literally in the film, but you know what I mean. Unfortunately, despite some truly deafening publicity, Minder got spanked in the ratings by the opposition's cover star. But at least it provided a truly classic TV Times cover, complete with snow in the logo for the first time. It also started an unfortunately escalating trend of bellowing about competitions, with a winning line giving you the chance to share 50 grand worth of prizes. Not 50 grand itself, of course, that would be too easy. Channel TV Times also used the same cover image, minus the competition, and Spec featured a star-studded festive feast, the centrepiece of which was the Welsh-language musical movie Idinath Rhywun Nadolig, The Man Who Stole Christmas, featuring Michael Povey as mobster Mordecai, flanked by his henchman Louis Thomas as Knuckles and Alice Samuel as Sonic. Farad. By 1986, Jane Torville and Christopher Dean were the second biggest couple in Britain. 2 years after their unprecedented 100% showing in the Winter Olympics in Sarajevo, Rod Ebdon photographed them in a graceful cover as part of their winter spectacular Fire and Ice, shown underneath fellow ice skater the late Sean McGill as the Magician, as well as an incongruous but cheerful Dumbo, and a chance to be a winner in a £200,000 holiday bonanza. Channel TV Times keeps the same image but dispenses with the promotion in favour of the list of stars again. No, that doesn't say Jumbo. Jambo was a gentle giant of a gorilla who was housed at Durrell Wildlife Park in Jersey, hence his billing as a channel star, and became famous that year for protecting 5-year-old Levin Merritt after he fell into his enclosure and lost consciousness, and doing it a lot less ambiguously than Harambe, which is why both he and the kid survived. His behaviour changed the public's perception of gorillas, and yet we still wait with bated breath for the CGI film of his exploits. Over in Wales, Spec decided to make animation the focus of the cover, with another serial animation cartoon, this time the first of 3 chapters of Sion Bruen Koch, Fox Tales, entitled A Winter Story, featuring a fox family stealing a turkey from a farmer for their dinner. It's been shown repeatedly on the BBC mostly, and it is indeed very heartwarming, unless you're a vegetarian or a vegan. Sadly, this was the last time TV Times would look halfway classy at Christmas. And one of the last times of all, really. All those competitions on the cover were a portent. Having seen them increase in popularity all of the time, the magazine saw it as a signal to capture the prole market by steadily trundling downwards, giving more and more coverage to Corrie and Emmerdale, Crossroads while it lasted, and introducing features like real-life stories, horoscopes, even the odd knitting pattern, all of which suggested that they'd given up the fight against Radio Times and were now aiming at the much softer target of the Woman's Realm market. Not that the Radio Times were above including horoscopes for a little bit either, but they don't like to talk about that now. 1987's Christmas TV Times cover was given over to Coronation Street, surprisingly enough for the first time, Pat Feeney's cameos notwithstanding. That was okay, quite charming in fact, as this photo by Peter Bolton saw Julie Goodyear's Bet Lynch opening presents with the iconic Hilda Ogden, as played by Jean Alexander, who departed the cobbles on Christmas Day itself. Even the irritating split of Ghostbusters into 2 words, complete with reversed logo, couldn't spoil things. In fact, Channel TV Times, or rather CTV Times as they changed the name again to coincide with their new futuristic logo, actually corrected this with their version of the same cover. Spec's cover takes a certain amount of explaining. This deconstructed Christmas present is directly based on S4C's Christmas ident that year. Which in itself was adapted from the new regular ident, which had debuted in the spring. The effect here, however, is somewhat akin to the abstract modernist pieces that Radio Times were using in the 30s, which is at least different for the 1980s. The real decline in the TV Times first became apparent in 1988. Once again, Minder was the cover story, this time in photographic form, again taken by Peter Bolton, and with George Cole and Dennis Waterman sporting the Regulation TV Times Santa suits. Unfortunately, they had to shout to be heard over a barrage of garishly coloured visual noise, promising features on Jean Alexander, having been physically there last year, Harrison Ford, Bros, Dame Edna Everage, a particularly soppy-faced Michael Crawford, photographed by Simon Fowler, and 0898 competitions out the wazoo, whatever a wazoo is. win a 20 grand rover, win a round the world holiday, win a pendant with your sign of the zodiac on it. Oh yes, and ITV and Channel 4 listings as well. The CTV Times, however, eschewed this aesthetic, creating their own cover for the first time in God knows how long, featuring their local continuity announcers, and of course Oscar Puffin, in pantomime garb doing Dick Whittington, all taken by Stuart McAllister. Spec, now apparently titled Spec 4, like the worst sequel in a long-running franchise, was by now no longer a TV Times put-out, but an entirely separate magazine that had to be bought, albeit only for a fraction of the price of the TV Times. It gave us a much more lovely wintry Victorian Edwardian backdrop, certainly a lot easier on the eye than the TV Times had become. By 1989, the involvement of any ITV companies themselves in the making of TV Times was minimal and drawing to a close. Within a few months, the magazine was sold to IPC Magazines Limited, and the decade was seen out with a photo taken by Francis Loney of Des O'Connor, looking much the same as he had 20 years earlier, only browner, and straining to be seen through an even more deafening cloud of noise as he presents the TV Times Top 10 Awards beneath a gift-tagged logo. The noise this year involves Michael Aspel, Bette Midler, Sir John Mills and daughter Juliet, Cliff Richard, Kylie Minogue, Lady Olivier, and photographically Patricia Hodge and her son Alexander, taken by Brian Harris, and Roald Dahl's BFG, only slightly bigger than a revived Tiny Santa sliding down 100 grand winning lines promo. CTV Times again uses the same cover, but marginally less noisy. Spec, meanwhile, had a glass window design with various stars of S4C's lineup, including the most Welsh singer of them all, Tom Jones. The gaudy aesthetic arguably peaked in 1990. By now, the new owners had redesigned the magazine again to become almost feverishly loud, garish and shouty, with everything written in fat serif fonts in massive capitals, and more often than not ending in exclamation points. It's like drinking sunny delight while smacking yourself on the head with a croquet mallet, and I can't believe even the most undereducated housing estate prole not feeling deeply patronised by the whole thing. Such was ITC's vision to ensure the title's survival when the floodgates were opened in 1991. But we run ahead of ourselves. That Christmas saw Sally Whittaker, now Dinah Moore, and Helen Worth as Sally Webster and Gail Potter, both pregnant and in Santa suits, at least their characters were. Sally gave birth on Christmas Eve, Gail gave birth on Christmas Day, was this whole big thing. The photo was taken by John Paul Brooke, known in the industry simply as John Paul. Despite all that minimalistic white space, the poor ladies are still straining to be seen. Amidst all the border clip art, the competition to win 3 Fiesta XR2Is, an inset photo of Ken Dodd taken by Brian Moody, shrieking banners about programming and the 14-day film guide, and more sans serif fonts bellowing that you could win and indeed win 100 grand with these random numbers in yet another competition. I don't want to come across as a middle-class snob, not least because I'm actually a pretentious member of the working class in disguise, and my fellow middle-class go-writer can vouch for that. But he really can't deny, or indeed escape, the magazine's aggressive, almost lascivious pursuit at the bottom end of the market by now. This was also the last Christmas for CTV Times, again using the same photo, but with slightly more tasteful visual noise. Channel's own magazine was basically predicated on the existence of the listings magazine duopoly. As I've already hinted, with the Broadcasting Act 1990, that was about to be broken up, and a whole gaggle of new titles would arrive to flood the market. There was no way CTV Times could possibly have competed. Faced with the inevitability of losing more money than it made, it finally bowed to the inevitable on the 19th of October the following year, and allowed the TV Times to provide a full Channel Islands variant, the last of the ITV franchises to do so. Spec, however, continued as normal, with some animated elves hijacking Santa's sleigh, or rather some little kid pretending to be Santa, with just the one reindeer. Maybe he's the one doing the hijacking. I'm honestly not sure. And so we reach another watershed. The deregulation of TV listings have been on the cards for quite some time now. Other magazine publishers have been complaining throughout the 80s that it was unfair, and the takeover of TV Times by IPC was pretty much a line in the sand. But with the passing of the Broadcasting Act 1990, the abolition of the IBA and its replacement with the light touch ITC, it now had a date and a time. Friday the 1st of March 1991. This deregulation meant the end of the TV and Radio Times monopoly on the market. No longer did you have to buy both magazines every week. All your TV and radio listings, BBC One, BBC Two, ITV, Channel 4, radios 1, 2, 3 and 4 and commercial radio, and the exotic other worlds of satellite and cable, could all be found in one or the other. Or indeed one of the flood of almost indistinguishable new lightweight listings magazines, with names like TV Quick, TV and Satellite Week, or the brutally utilitarian What's on TV. At the same time, women's magazines were undergoing a metamorphosis. The middle-class market had previously been the preserve of the neuroses and knitting patterns monthlies, such as Woman's Own and Family Circle. But by the early 90s, the more sophisticated and aspirational likes of Cosmopolitan and a relaunched Marie Claire had captured the imagination of the bourgeois housewife and made the likes of Family Circle and Living look stuffy and strictly menopausal. The traditional magazines that didn't collapse altogether in the onslaught survived by finding a new market in working-class women, who, if the resulting modern women's magazines are anything to go by, they apparently characterised as gossiping fishwives with a morbid interest in celebrity culture and disturbingly horrific real-life stories of perversity and suffering. What does this have to do with anything? I've had £1 for every time I've heard that question. Well, the main market for the Radio and TV Times had traditionally always been female. Women with time on their hands between housewifely chores, expected to plan the household's viewing along with the rest of their lives. Now, the form of the TV listings magazine had been thrown open for anyone to use, and the obvious thing to do was to fuse it with that of the women's magazine. And not the cosmopolitan Marie Claire end of the market. Radio Times could have those. But the mythical sociopathic fishwives interested in soaps, celebrities and suffering. Soon the likes of TV Quick were prefacing the week's programming with stories about dead children and Alzheimer's. And now they were without the backing of one of the main broadcasters, which allowed the Radio Times to emerge mostly unscathed. To survive, TV Times had to follow them down. As such, the first massive BBC and satellite-equipped Christmas TV Times depicted the cast of The Darling Buds of May, taken by Rod Ebdon. For a change, not in front of a white backdrop and surrounded by marginally less visual noise than usual, although the usual opportunities to win Vauxhall cars or a holiday to Australia remain. The Larkin's appearance in 1991 was actually the last time for a long while that the Christmas TV Times would put a programme on its cover. Not so for Spec, which rapidly came full circle from a supplement to the TV Times to briefly becoming a TV guide in its own right, to now being a supplement again, now in the newspaper The Western Mail. It also had perhaps the least Welsh cover in its history, apart from the presence of Hywel Bennett in the bottom left. Apart from that, we've got Carmen Silvera and Kirsten Cook cuddling up with Bill Owen in full compo garb, in what might be one of the most ill-advised sitcom crossovers in history, and most bizarrely of all, Daniela Westbrook in the lap of Clive James. This is one Christmas party I'd rather avoid. I prefer to read Clive's review of it on Boxing Day than have him in amongst it. So if TV Times covers were no longer programming based, what did that leave? Welcome to the era of the cheap greetings card cover, which isn't intended as a slight on the artists themselves, incidentally. The first of whom was Mark Thomas in 1992. He essayed a bowler-hatted snowman falling victim to a cat showing territorial defiance towards a dog. This year also sees the first mention of Video Plus, a VCR scheduling system that's naturally 8 kinds of obsolete now and therefore all but forgotten. Basically, you set up the video by typing in special codes consisting of random numbers, which, at least in theory, guaranteed that the recording would start and end precisely with the programme. thus eliminating the need to add a 5 or 10 minute buffer zone where you capture the last 10 minutes of the local news before the big movie premiere. It's obviously the bane of us video archaeologists' life. But these codes were printed in the listing magazines until it became pointless to do so. More cars to be won, this time a Rover Metro, so they might as well have not bothered, and the logo itself has also undergone a slight evolution, stumbling into a bevelling machine and not quite writing itself in time, leaving it in italics for the rest of its life. Spec continued the photographic covers, dominated by the reliably Welsh Lynette Jones and Daniel Travanti in The Winter Stallion, or The Christmas Stallion, or indeed Era Contagaiaf if you were watching the Welsh language version, which was made simultaneously and shown on S4C, who produced the thing. Also present, Victoria Wood, May Jones in Come On Midfield, and Michael Barrymore. Notice how the English language programming is slowly becoming more prominent than the Welsh parts. Partly because, along with all the other magazines, Spec is now an all-channel affair. 1993 saw the first appearance of a particularly disreputable-looking cartoon Father Christmas, driving what might have happened if they'd had Pimp My Ride in the 20s. Very appropriate for the new franchise era of Meridian, West Country, GMTV, and most especially Carlton. But look at that front bumper. Is it true? Could Father Christmas really be Noel Edmonds? Is that the crinkly bottom mansion in the background? Or is it just that Noel is another word for Christmas? Questions need answering. They absolutely do not. The artist responsible is Graham Thompson, most famous for his illustrations for jumbo jigsaw puzzles. Another prize of 125 grand to be won, and the first mention of the number of movies showing during the festive period, something they clearly noticed their rivals doing from the previous year. Over 800 films showing this year, and that number will only increase. This year also saw a brief revival of the TV Times Christmas Extra, albeit in the issue itself rather than as a pull-out supplement, which kind of makes you question the point. And hark, it's true, the bearded Noel really is Santa. Alright, so it's only for Noel's Christmas family video presents, but he was in House Party the week before as well. Meanwhile, Spec journeyed to a newly restored Russia in the form of Goodile Lenin, Leaving Lenin, a comedy film where some teenagers and their teachers rediscover themselves in the freshly renamed St. Petersburg. How fun. Surrounding them were almost nothing Welsh, Ian McShane's antique dealer Lovejoy on BBC One, Jack Nicholson as Jack Napier, aka the Joker, in Tim Burton's omnipresent Batman on BBC Two, except it wasn't, it was on BBC One. Welsh soprano Rebecca Evans in a snowy special in Norway on S4C, and Helen Mirren in the highly festive Prime Suspect on ITV. And apparently there was nothing worth watching on Channel 4 or satellite, so they just stuck Father Christmas in there opposite a snowman. Graham Thompson's slightly disturbing cartoon interpretation of the Fat Man reappeared on the 1994 TV Times Christmas cover. This time, the worryingly drunk-looking Santa performs a hit-and-run outside a suburban home while DUI. Another chance to win a holiday. No brag about the number of films, but we did get a 20-page film pull-out instead. It's also the last year to brag about having Video Plus codes, although Sky Plus and DVDs wouldn't properly enter the mainstream until the end of the decade, so it seems a bit premature. The Christmas Extra, because they've decided that's still a thing, looks at a Christmas weekend in the life of holiday and former TVAM presenter Kathy Taylor and family. Spec's Christmas cover features a startling shot of a Brookside pantomime. It's very much a soap-heavy cover, in fact, as you've also got Riquet and Bien Ah, and Nick Berry and Neve Cusack from Heartbeat, if you think that counts. But no Pobly Cum. In fact, very little Welsh, despite that ostensibly being the point. Graham Thompson's Alcoholic Santa made his third and final appearance on the 1995 cover, as a simple yet terribly disturbing close-up and three-quarter profile. Despite the unsettling nature of the picture, the cover is at least less noisy than it has been in recent years, although the cars and cash competitions and the pull-out film guide are still present and correct. This year also marks the very last appearance of the Christmas Extra in any form, and sees EastEnders star Letitia Dean in pantomime as Snow White, alongside the ultimate daytime queen Lorraine Kelly with her daughter Rosie. Also making its last appearance, at least as far as I'm concerned, is Spec, which isn't even called Spec anymore. At least the cover is properly Welsh, graced by newsreaders Angharad Meyer from S4C and Kevin Owen and Sarah Edwards from BBC Wales. You may have noticed the Spec name getting smaller and smaller. Now it's entirely disappeared, and the Western Mail's TV guide was given the almost brutally utilitarian name Television Wales. I suspect there were actually more guides after this point, but as the association with TV Times is basically dead and gone, they definitely lie outside the scope of this programme. After 3 in a row of the Alcopop Santa Creep Show, TV Times' next 3 years all featured photos of upcoming programmes, and all incongruously BBC programmes, which will never not look wrong to me. First up in 1996, Wallace and Gromit. They were everywhere Christmas 1995, with their newest short, A Close Shave, debuting on BBC Two that Christmas Eve, and the boys even taking the starring role in the channel's Christmas ident. Unfortunately for the TV Times, this was 1996, and A Close Shave showing that year, along with the 2 preceding shorts, was a repeat. But it's the thought that counts, and the cover photo, arranged by Nick Park and taken by Paul Norris, was at least relatively Christmassy. And this year, 18 cars to be won, with the number having changed to 0930. Can't fool us that easily. The phenomenon of 1997 was the Teletubbies. That's right, they're nearly 30 years old. Deal with it. Notwithstanding a wintry backdrop, sparkles on the text, and of course the requisite snow on the logo, this isn't particularly Christmassy like last year's was. In fact, the photo of Tinky Winky, Dipsy, Lala and Ringo was actually a BBC library photo by Mark Harrison, superimposed onto said wintry backdrop. But it's still more festive than some of the covers from the start of the 70s with Val and Max, so it's not as if modern life is rubbish. More, albeit non-specific, prizes to be won, and as well as the presence of the newly launched Channel 5, the Movie Boast is back. Over 1,000 to watch this time around. By 1998, IPC Magazines Limited was now IPC Media, and the earliest sproutings of reality TV had arrived to smash through in the ratings, with the most popular non-fiction show of the year being Changing Rooms, a hybrid of game show, DIY and Sunset Yellow FCF. So, for the 3rd year in a row, TV Times had a BBC show on its Christmas cover, with Handy Andy Kane, Carol Smiley and Lawrence Llewellyn-Bowen in a specially dressed cover by Alan Ollie. Technically the last full photographic Christmas cover to date for the magazine, although the smaller inset photos will remain for many more years. Again, there's the usual cash and cars competitions and money off the latest CDs and videos. For 1999, the close of the decade, century and millennium, TV Times decided to at least fake being classic, with this genuinely rather splendid Haddon Sundblom-esque depiction of the fat man at work, drawn beautifully by Aldo Balding. It's probably the first time this cover could easily have been used for the Radio Times, apart from the chance to win a brand new Porsche and to ski the millennium in a winter holiday. But it's probably the most tasteful the magazine had been over the past 40 to 50 years. In 2000, the cover was taken over by one of the Coca-Cola polar bears, or more accurately, something extraordinarily similar drawn by Kevin Jenkins, because even Coke can't copyright Ursus Maritimus. There's Mr. K. Kringle flying over the logo in the background, almost as an homage to the cartoon version of the Fat Man doing the same in the mid-70s. As well as £100 worth of prizes, you'll notice the presence of digital listings for the first time. In 2001, Mick Brownfield was poached from his usual work for the Radio Times to provide a looming Father Christmas holding the power of the sun, in the form of a small snow globe with a family watching television with his face on it, in the palm of his hands. This time there's a chance to win a Porsche 911, a slightly unfortunate choice of model that year. And taking its cue from Arrival, a post of 2,000 films over the Christmas fortnight, plus a mention of David Jason, who was on double duty that Christmas, as indeed was John Sullivan, with Only Fools back on BBC One and the Sullivan-penned Macabre on ITV. Jason was to prominently feature in 2002 as well, whose cover had a rather sinister-looking Kringle, smiling a little too creepily for my liking. Drawn by two artists, George Sharp and Rob McCaig. Movies are still at 2,000, the cash and cars are still up for grabs, and it's also the revival of the smaller inset photo, the first since Doddy 12 years ago. In this case, it's taken by Mark Bourdion, and it's of David Jason and Nicholas Lyndhurst as Del Boy and Rodney, as the Trotters returned again in the second of 3 ill-advised revival episodes of Only Fools and Horses. Whilst If They Could See Us Now had done solid work in the ratings the previous year, and wasn't a terrible watch or anything, certainly not as bad as its reputation, the story was still over as of the 1996 trilogy where they became millionaires. This year's one, Strangers on the Shore, and the concluding episode the following year, Sleepless in Peckham, did improve things a little, but not enough. It didn't help that the cast was steadily dying off, with Buster Merryfield and Kenneth MacDonald gone before the trilogy even began, nor the fact that 1 or 2 of the specials were meant to actually go out the following Easter, before some wily BBC executive realised that spacing them out over 3 years, despite them all being filmed together, would basically sort out the Christmas Day schedule until at least 2004. 2003 was the year the ITC's duties were absorbed by Ofcom, who still exist to this day. The TV Times gave us another Mick Brownfield depiction of Dan Claus smiling beatifically, as he seems rather pleased to have received a Christmas card. Again, more Porsches to be won, or a Land Rover if that takes your fancy, and a foreshadowing of the desire to chase soap opera viewers above all, with the pulse-pounding excitement of an exclusive Heartbeat story, and a will-they-won't-they conundrum for Kat Slater and Alfie Moon, as played by Jesse Wallace and Shane Ritchie, and taken by Tom Howard, having apparently recovered from his death and got out of the boating industry and into photography. Incidentally, spoiler warning, they did. 2004 was again by Mick Brownfield, and strikingly similar to the dead-eyed snowman he made for the Radio Times Christmas cover in 1992, right down to the twig eyebrows. There are some differences though. The bowler hat is replaced with a Santa hat, the scarf changed from red to orange, and the button eyes have been changed to charcoal, which are also used as buttons. And he's holding a Disneyfied singing robin. Subtly different enough to be fresh, even among the 2 or 3 viewers who would have noticed the similarity to a different magazine's cover from 12 years earlier. This year there's a chance to win a fabulous new car, unspecified. Presumably they'd run out of Porsches. There's a Foyle's Wall Christmas story and a Corrie wedding between Claire Casey and Ashley Peacock, as played by Julia Hayworth and Stephen Arnold, and photographed by Nikki Johnston. 2005 saw a return for Mr. Santaman and a cartoon Robin, once again by Mick Brownfield in his final TV Times contribution. Santa has remained on the cover at Christmas ever since in one form or another. As you'll see, after a while they've become largely interchangeable, if they haven't already. This bumper double issue comes with great free view listings, just in case you were still a bit sore from ITV Digital's collapse, as well as John Nettles as DCI Tom Barnaby, taken by Colin Munn, in a special Midsummer Murders tie-in story, a rare Happy Christmas in Warford, as Cat and Alfie, again taken by Nikki Johnston, depart Albert Square on Christmas Day in a snowy episode of EastEnders. Incidentally, the happy ending is in spite of this, not because of it. 2006 was almost identical to the previous year, albeit Santa's now holding a sack full of toys, including a teddy bear, this time painted by a returning Mark Thomas, who essays an eerily baby-faced, faintly Japanese Santa. By now, the use of 1 or 2 smaller photos has been replaced by the somewhat lazier appearances of the highlights of the season, and no photographer credits inside, a technique which has continued ever since. The number of films has increased again, growing to over 3,000 over the course of the last 4 years, and there's a chance to win a 42-inch digital TV, represented by Digit Owl, the forgotten CGI creation voiced by Matt Lucas, who told viewers to prepare themselves for the switch over from terrestrial to digital in the coming years. What a long time ago that seems now. 2007 was again pretty much a carbon copy of its predecessor, with Santa in the same position, except with a robin replacing the teddy bear. Even the humble brag about over 3,000 films is the same. Our artist this time is Pamela Story Johnson, beginning an epic 7-year run on festive TV Times duty. Her next entry in 2008 was even more of a clone than before, now showing Santa in a joyous sleigh ride with a snowman. I ship it. Once again, no change in the number of movies being promoted, but no holidays this year. Instead, a chance to win a model of Wallace and Gromit, which, unless you hadn't seen the opposition's Christmas cover that year, you can't have failed to notice had a new short on that Christmas. A Matter of Loaf and Death. Other highlights included the Strictly copycat Dancing on Ice, which had Torvald and Dean returning to the cover after over 20 years. The Pamela Story Johnson cover run continues in 2009, Santa now on his own again, and on ice skates. Virtually nothing else new to this cover compared to the previous year, except that the price keeps rising, of course. At least the competition's a little different, with not one but 2 life-size Daleks to be won, and photos signed by every Doctor up to that point, presumably including the dead ones somehow. But not Matt Smith, because David Tennant didn't regenerate into him until New Year's Day. Still worth a punt though. 2010 is the halfway point of Pamela Story Johnson's run. Father Christmas has now finally reached the chimney. It's getting decidedly squeezed out by a resurgence of visual noise, however. Prizes are more varied this year, with the chance to win a 3D TV for the attosecond that was popular, a Blu-ray player, a Wii, or a Toy Story toy. 2011 has Pamela Story Johnson drawing Santa and his snowy boyfriend putting some extremely tiny Christmas crackers with some mice and a robin. Your prizes this year: Sky Movies free for a year, and a 42-inch HD TV to watch it on, plus an iPad. No other major changes except that the declaration the magazine is now great for Freeview, which is just as well because the big digital switchover was months away at this point. 2012 sees Pamela Story Johnson's Santa feeding his reindeer while the Tiny Mouse family look on. It's all getting a bit Victoria Plum, to be honest. At least it pushes the highlights off to the side a bit, which now includes Brendan O'Carroll in Mrs. Brown's Boys, oh joy. He and his show have continued to appear annually on the big day for years, to increasingly dwindling ratings, although it still hasn't reached a low enough point to stop it coming back. Pamela Story Johnson's penultimate cover reunites the happy couple again to watch some rodent winter sports. The mice spent ages setting this up, so they better way look delighted. The snowman's lost his hat and his carrot nose, replacing it with a tangerine, so as to better match Raymond Briggs's one. Just makes him look dopier, to be honest. Apparently last year's magazine wasn't good enough for Freeview, but this one is. The prizes on offer this year are a bit of a downgrade: some Lego sets, some Harry Potter goodies, some U-View boxes, which were almost instantly forgotten about, and some big TVs. 2014 saw IPC Media change its name to Time Inc. UK, since Time Inc. had owned it since 1988 anyway. It also marked the 8th and final cover for Pamela Story Johnson, harking back to the previous view with crackers being pulled by toys. It's just as well as her last one, as her Santa is looking increasingly haggard. At least this time there have been some smaller, subtler changes to the layout. For a start, the number of films, which have been stuck at over 3,000 for a few years, has actually gone down to 2,500, albeit now rated. The prizes on offer have shrunk to just 12 iPad minis, and the highlights, which were in danger of taking over the whole thing, have been reduced to just the 4 inserts down the side. 2015 finally saw us get a new artist in the shape of Tom Newsom, who admittedly didn't deviate from the familiar format of Santa doing a thing, but it was just nice to have a different Santa after nearly a decade. And this one's all very Haddon Sunblum Coca-Cola advert. What wasn't so nice was the bigger price jump this year. Having only increased by 10p nearly every year for some time, and actually fluctuating up and down during the 90s, this now soared by 30p. That promise of being the biggest soaps guide and the chance to win Lego sets alongside the iPad minis better be worth it. This year there are 110 great shows previewed, and presumably several billion terrible ones as well, but never mind. 2016 zoomed in on Tom Newsom's Santa this time, as he was bringing us the magic of Christmas, rather than wishing readers a happy or merry Christmas, for the first time in nearly 20 years. And there are no longer any competitions being promoted, presumably because they sold out of Apple gear. We do get another 110 great shows previewed though. Tom Newsom's third and final cover in 2017 sees his Santa actually doing his job for a change. Although to me he started to look increasingly like Captain Birdseye wandered into the artwork by mistake. The phrase Merry Christmas returns, and the film count has finally vanished long after the novelty had been made redundant by DVDs and digital television anyway. Not much changing the highlights, as the TV schedule has been getting rather repetitive for some time now, and indeed remains so to this day. The number has increased to the rather odd and arbitrary 327. Did they actually go through and count it all out? In 2018, Time Inc. UK renamed to TI Media for no apparent reason, and it was not a vintage Christmas for the TV Times cover-wise, or the Radio Times for that matter. And that's certainly saying something after what I've been describing for the past 2 hours or so. It does at least look fine at first. It's another Santa, of course, only slightly creepy looking, and hugging a snowman. Although it's only Patricia Story Johnson's Santa and snowman that are part of my ship, so this doesn't count. The thing is, though, this isn't commissioned artwork. This is a stock image that you can license yourself from Dreamtime. For what it's worth, the artist is a Russian named Peter Babkin, but with all due respect, I doubt he was thinking terribly hard about it when he made it. This is clip art, basically, and might very well be the laziest the cover's ever got. I suppose it's possible the magazine was hurting for money at this point, but equally I think it's possible they could have just paid an artist to create something new, for as much as it cost to license this image. Note also that it's been calling itself the original Christmas TV Guide for the past couple of years. I'd like to see they're working on that, but they ran with it for another few years and it is less obnoxious than the Radio Times calling themselves legendary. 2019 was a lot more charming, even if the magazine is doomed to forever have Father Christmas on the cover for the rest of time. At least this is an unusual one, as drawn by the German illustrator Axel Scheffler, the artist who is a frequent collaborator with Julia Donaldson for her many, many children's books, like The Gruffalo, or in this case, promoting that year's special, The Snail and the Whale. And there's a new logo, the words TV and Times separated out again for the first time in nearly 40 years, as part of a revamp earlier in the year. By 2020, TI Media was acquired by Future plc, who are the TV Times' current owners, and who I'll always remember as the company that bought PC Zone in order to kill it off. Unfortunately, being the year of the plague, we got a bit of a mishmash of a cover, although given the circumstances it's obviously forgivable. It's a traditionalist approach, and actually a collage in disguise. The slightly untrustworthy Father Christmas is actually a photo by George Doyle which had been partially drawn over, while the white-gloved hand holding the presents comes from an entirely different photo by Polish photographer Roman Millet, and the presents and ribbons themselves come courtesy of Canadian snapper Jennifer Barrow. All stock pictures again, but this time with a bloody good excuse, and more importantly, actual effort expended beyond listlessly searching Google Images. 2021 gave us some more familiar Coca-Cola style Santa once again, drawn by American artist Larry Jones. All very lovely and luscious, if still a little generic looking, although that's not the fault of the artist by any means. It's just that by this point we've reached a point that the various TV listings magazines are largely interchangeable. 2022 was the 40th anniversary of The Snowman, and in a depressing coincidence, the year of the death of Raymond Briggs. He also created two much more light-hearted books about Father Christmas, both of which were turned into a single animation originally broadcast in 1991, with the jolly old elf voiced brilliantly by Mel Smith. Most people, including myself, may have expected the Radio Times to pay tribute with its own Christmas cover, although they had already done that in 2013, which in itself was already a repeat of the previous year, and was itself repeated 5 years later. You see what I mean about the interchangeability. Instead, the TV Times decided to honour the late artist with this straightforward and rather wonderful tribute instead, showing him holding his pet dog with his reindeer in his barn/shed in the background. It may technically be a repeat of a repeat of a repeat, and it's obviously not been drawn by Briggs himself from beyond the grave, most likely by his team at Blooming Productions, which includes Christmas Radio Times stalwart Robin Shaw. But it is actually rather lovely, especially as it didn't have any inset photos for the first time in ages. And in fact they stopped doing that altogether since then, which is a nice touch. For 2023, the pared down design is equally as good as the previous year, with artist Richard Johnson giving us this pastel-like look at Santa ice skating, or bouncy ellipsoid figures, darker colours, outright shadows, dynamic motion and perspective. It has energy and atmosphere, something the Radio Times has been sorely lacking at this point. All the gold text and the obligatory wish to have a magical Christmas could be seen as a little tacky, but it's actually done quite tastefully. And as I've said, it helps that all that screaming probate visual noise seems to have been consigned to history, at least for now. Almost as if they're trying to do a better job of selling themselves. Well, at Christmas at least. The regular issues still do all that. Last year, 2024, if you're still with us, was again by Richard Johnson and features the same lovingly rendered version of Father Christmas, with his fellow elves assisting with his delivery. Or possibly he's just hallucinating from it. It depends on whether you read that hand as being in mid-swat or not. The logo's been given a very nice red sparkling jewel effect, and the streaming promotion has gone, replaced by another declaration that this is the biggest ever issue. It's no longer calling itself Britain's best loved TV magazine though. It started calling itself that 5 years earlier, and to be honest, it was a bit of a stretch then. In fact, by this point it doesn't seem particularly well loved even by its own publishers, who've made it entirely subordinate to the tackier pamphlet-side publication What's on TV, with its faint but discernible whiff of contempt for its own readers. This year, as the TV Times marks its 70th anniversary, it's not like 2025 could hark back to 1955. We don't really want to do a photo of King Charles III. Instead, perhaps predictably but by no means unwelcome, Richard Johnson returns for a third consecutive year. Once again with Father Christmas. He's not going anywhere anytime soon. Head on this time and surrounded by carolling snow people, thank you Michael Grade, against a lovely lilac evening sky. There's no longer a boast about it being the biggest ever issue, but at £5.50 it is now a whole £1 cheaper than the Radio Times. The TV Times still sells reasonably well, inasmuch as any magazine still sells in the age of the internet and post-plague. At last count, it was the 20th best-selling magazine in the country, and the 4th most popular TV listings magazine. Radio Times is in third, and second and first respectively are the almost indistinguishable What's on TV and TV Choice, both featuring colossal fonts and garish colours printed on tissue paper and sold for pennies. As indeed is the TV Times these days, and two of these three are owned by the same company anyway. The Radio Times had its identity as the official organ of the BBC, and its ties to the corporation helped it to hang on to that identity for grim death, even after deregulation, competition, and ultimately being sold off. The TV Times was already in the process of giving up its corporate ties to the ITV network and aiming for its patronising idea of the working class audience, when it was still, newspapers aside, the only game in town as far as ITV listings were concerned. Today, while it still tries to impress a little more at Christmas than it did during the new millennium, it still arguably has a history, but not a legacy. It barely even has an online presence, unlike its rival. The logo, introduced in 1981, italicised over 10 years later and separated back out just over 5 years ago, is its only, increasingly shaky link to a time when it was functionally distinguishable from the What's on TVs of this world. Well, that and the fact that at Christmas it makes more effort than some of its counterparts. There may not be much more than TV Times in TV Times magazine anymore, but at least they try. And having survived alternative regional magazine competition, numerous ITV franchise rounds, the arrival of a fourth channel, the amalgamation of BBC listings, the birth of satellite and cable, and the ongoing dominance of streaming services, it almost appears to be still going out of a pure desire to survive more than anything else. In this day and age of an everything everywhere all at once society, That's surely a good thing, and its history should be remembered with fondness. Even if both their names change in time to more accurately reflect a changing society, perhaps as long as the Radio Times exists, so should the TV Times. Whoever knew there was so much in it?
The search, it never stops.